Have you ever wondered why one of the most influential figures in early Christianity was systematically erased from history? Why the woman who stood closest to Jesus, who witnessed his most intimate moments, who was called the apostle to the apostles, suddenly vanished from the official story? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most explosive cover-ups in religious history, the deliberate suppression of Mary Magdalene's gospel and the centuries-long campaign to silence her voice. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you thought you knew about early Christianity. We're not talking about some fringe theory or conspiracy nonsense. We're talking about documented historical evidence, ancient manuscripts, and a pattern of deliberate destruction that spans nearly 2,000 years. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the Vatican fought so hard to keep these texts buried, and why discovering them changes our entire understanding of Christian origins. But first, let me tell you something that will blow your mind. In 1945, a farmer digging for fertilizer near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi made a discovery that would shake the foundations of organized religion. Hidden in a sealed jar, buried for over 16 centuries, he found 52 ancient texts. Among them was something the Church had spent centuries trying to destroy: the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. This wasn't just another religious manuscript. This was a first-person account from the woman who many scholars now believe was Jesus' closest companion, his most trusted disciple, and possibly much more. For the first time in nearly 2 millennia, her voice could be heard again, and what she had to say was revolutionary. Now, I've spent months researching this story, diving deep into ancient manuscripts, consulting with biblical scholars, and tracing the historical evidence. What I discovered is a systematic campaign of suppression that makes modern censorship look like child's play. We're talking about a coordinated effort to rewrite history, to eliminate an entire perspective from the Christian narrative, and to transform one of Christianity's most important figures into something she never was. Here's what makes this story so incredible. Mary Magdalene wasn't just some random follower. According to multiple early Christian texts, she was Jesus' primary disciple. She was the one he chose to receive his most profound teachings. She was the first to witness the resurrection. She was called the apostle to the apostles because she was the one who brought news of Jesus' return to the male disciples. And yet, somewhere along the way, her story was completely rewritten. Instead of being remembered as the spiritual leader she was, Mary Magdalene was transformed into a repentant prostitute. Instead of being celebrated as the keeper of Jesus' deepest wisdom, she was reduced to a cautionary tale about sin and redemption. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate campaign to diminish her authority and erase her teachings from Christian doctrine. But why? Why would the early church go to such lengths to suppress Mary Magdalene's gospel and rewrite her story? The answer lies in what her texts actually contain. Because when you read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you discover teachings that fundamentally challenge the power structure that was being built around early Christianity. In her Gospel, Mary Magdalene presents a version of Jesus' message that emphasizes direct spiritual experience over institutional authority. She describes teachings where salvation comes through inner knowledge rather than through the mediation of priests. She presents a Christianity where women hold equal spiritual authority with men, where the divine can be accessed directly by anyone willing to undertake the inner journey. You can see the problem. If Mary Magdalene's version of Christianity had become the dominant narrative, there would have been no need for a hierarchical church structure. There would have been no justification for an all-male priesthood. There would have been no basis for claiming exclusive authority over salvation. The entire power structure that the institutional church was building would have crumbled before it even began. So they made a choice. They chose power over truth. They chose institutional control over spiritual authenticity, and Mary Magdalene became their first casualty. The suppression began early. By the 2nd century, church leaders were already working to diminish Mary Magdalene's role in the Jesus story. They started by questioning the reliability of texts that portrayed her as a primary disciple. They began promoting alternative versions of events that minimized her importance. And they started spreading stories that transformed her from a spiritual teacher into a reformed sinner. This wasn't some organic development. This was a calculated campaign. Church leaders understood that controlling the narrative meant controlling the future of Christianity. And Mary Magdalene's voice was too powerful, too authoritative, too threatening to their vision of what the church should become. The most devastating blow came in the year 591, when Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon that would define Mary Magdalene's image for the next 1400 years. In this sermon, he deliberately conflated 3 different women mentioned in the Gospels. He took Mary Magdalene, the disciple and apostle, and merged her identity with an unnamed sinful woman and with Mary of Bethany. But most significantly, he declared that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute who had been saved by Jesus' forgiveness. There was no biblical basis for this claim, none whatsoever. The canonical Gospels never identify Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. They never suggest she was sexually immoral. In fact, they consistently portray her as a devoted disciple and trusted companion. But Pope Gregory's sermon wasn't based on scripture, it was based on politics. By transforming Mary Magdalene from a spiritual authority into a repentant sinner, the Church accomplished several goals at once. They eliminated a potential challenge to male religious authority. They created a powerful symbol of female redemption through submission to church teaching, and they sent a clear message about what happened to women who claimed spiritual authority equal to men. The campaign worked. For over a millennium, Mary Magdalene was remembered not as the apostle to the apostles, but as the reformed prostitute. Her Gospels were banned, burned, and buried. Her teachings were declared heretical. Her voice was silenced so completely that most Christians forgot she had ever spoken at all. But here's the thing about truth. It has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to destroy it. Those ancient manuscripts that were buried in the Egyptian desert, they preserved Mary Magdalene's actual words for posterity. And when they were finally discovered in 1945, they revealed a story completely different from the one the Church had been telling for centuries. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene presents a figure of profound spiritual authority. In her own words, she describes receiving special revelations from Jesus that were not shared with the other disciples. She recounts teachings about the nature of the soul, the path to spiritual enlightenment, and the true meaning of Jesus' message. Most importantly, she presents herself as Jesus' chosen successor, the one entrusted with carrying forward his most essential teachings. This isn't speculation or interpretation. This is Mary Magdalene speaking in her own voice, preserved in her own gospel. And what she has to say challenges everything we thought we knew about early Christianity. In her text, Mary describes a vision where Jesus reveals to her the true nature of spiritual reality. He explains that the material world is an illusion, that salvation comes through recognizing one's divine nature, and that the kingdom of heaven exists within each person as a state of consciousness to be achieved through inner work. These teachings sound more like Eastern mysticism than traditional Christianity, and that's exactly why they were so threatening to church authorities. Because if Jesus' real message was about direct spiritual experience rather than institutional salvation, then what role was left for the church? Mary's Gospel also reveals the tension that existed between her and the male disciples. In one particularly revealing passage, Peter challenges her authority, asking, Did Jesus really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn around and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? This wasn't just about Mary Magdalene personally. This was about the role of women in early Christianity. And according to Mary's Gospel, that role was far more significant than the institutional church wanted to admit. Levi, another disciple, comes to Mary's defense in the text, saying, "Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against the woman like the adversaries. But if the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us." More than us. Those three words contain an entire revolution. Because if Jesus loved Mary Magdalene more than the other disciples, if he entrusted her with teachings he didn't share with them, if he chose her as his primary successor, then the entire foundation of Christian authority was built on a lie. This is why the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was so dangerous to the institutional church. It didn't just present an alternative version of events. It presented a version that completely undermined the authority structure the church was trying to establish, and so it had to be destroyed. The suppression wasn't just about burning books. It was about creating an entirely new mythology around Mary Magdalene that would make her original role unthinkable. The church didn't just want to silence her voice. They wanted to make sure that future generations would never even imagine she had once spoken with such authority. They succeeded for over 1,000 years, but the discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts changed everything. Suddenly, scholars had access to Mary Magdalene's actual words. They could compare her gospel with the canonical texts and see how different the original Christian movement really was from what it became. And what they found was explosive, because Mary Magdalene's Gospel wasn't the only suppressed text. The Nag Hammadi discovery included dozens of other early Christian writings that presented alternative versions of Jesus' teachings. Together, they revealed a Christianity that was far more diverse, far more mystical, and far more egalitarian than the version that ultimately triumphed. These texts showed that early Christianity wasn't the unified movement that church history claimed it was. It was a collection of competing traditions, different interpretations, and conflicting visions of what Jesus' message really meant. And Mary Magdalene's tradition was one of the most significant among them. But perhaps most importantly, these discoveries revealed the extent to which the institutional church had deliberately shaped the Christian narrative to serve its own interests. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's Gospel wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic campaign to eliminate alternative voices and create a monopoly on Christian truth. The evidence for this systematic suppression goes far beyond just Mary Magdalene's Gospel. When you start digging into the historical record, you find a pattern of deliberate destruction that targeted any Christian text or tradition that didn't fit the emerging Orthodox narrative. The church didn't just suppress Mary Magdalene's voice, they silenced an entire chorus of early Christian perspectives. Take the Gospel of Philip, another text found at Nag Hammadi. This gospel contains some of the most explicit references to Mary Magdalene's special relationship with Jesus. It describes her as the one who was called his companion and states that Jesus loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. When the other disciples questioned this favoritism, Jesus responded by asking them why he didn't love them the same way he loved her. This isn't just about romantic love. Though that interpretation has certainly captured popular imagination, this is about spiritual recognition. In the mystical traditions of the time, the kiss was a symbol of the transmission of divine knowledge. When Philip describes Jesus kissing Mary Magdalene, he's describing the passing of secret wisdom from teacher to student. But here's what makes this even more significant. The Gospel of Philip explicitly states that the companion of Christ is Mary Magdalene, and that Christ loved her more than he loved the male disciples. This text presents Mary Magdalene not just as an equal among the apostles, but as the first among them. She was Jesus' chosen successor, his spiritual heir, the one designated to carry forward his most essential teachings. The Church couldn't allow this narrative to survive. If Mary Magdalene was Jesus' primary disciple, if she was the repository of his deepest wisdom, then the entire apostolic succession claimed by the Church was built on false foundations. Peter couldn't be the rock upon which the Church was built if Mary Magdalene was actually Jesus' chosen successor. So they buried these texts. Literally. Church authorities ordered the destruction of any gospel or letter that contradicted their preferred version of events. Libraries were raided. Manuscripts were burned. Anyone caught possessing heretical texts faced excommunication or worse. The suppression was so thorough that most of these alternative gospels completely disappeared from the historical record. But some communities refused to give up their sacred texts. Instead of destroying them, they hid them. They sealed them in jars and buried them in the desert, hoping that someday the truth would resurface. The Nag Hammadi discovery proves that this strategy worked. After 16 centuries of silence, Mary Magdalene's voice emerged from the sand to tell her story again. What that story reveals is a version of Christianity that would be almost unrecognizable to modern believers. This wasn't the Christianity of churches and priests and institutional authority. This was a Christianity of direct mystical experience, of inner transformation, of spiritual equality between men and women. In Mary Magdalene's tradition, salvation didn't come through believing the right doctrines or participating in the correct rituals. It came through gnosis, direct spiritual knowledge that could be achieved by anyone willing to undertake the inner journey. This knowledge wasn't mediated by priests or controlled by institutions. It was available to all seekers, regardless of gender, social status, or religious background. The Gospel of Mary describes this path in detail. According to her text, Jesus taught that the material world is a temporary illusion and that the soul's true home is in the spiritual realm. The goal of life isn't to be saved by an external savior, but to awaken to one's own divine nature. This awakening comes through understanding the true self, transcending material attachments, and achieving unity with the divine source. This is radically different from the Christianity that emerged from the institutional church. Where Orthodox Christianity emphasized faith, Mary's tradition emphasized knowledge. Where Orthodox Christianity required submission to religious authority, Mary's tradition promoted direct spiritual experience. Where Orthodox Christianity relegated women to subordinate roles, Mary's tradition recognized them as spiritual equals. You can see why the Church found this so threatening. Mary Magdalene's Christianity didn't need priests to interpret divine will. It didn't need bishops to determine correct doctrine. It didn't need a pope to claim ultimate authority. In Mary's vision, every person was their own priest, their own interpreter, their own direct connection to the divine. This wasn't just a theological difference. This was an existential threat to the entire power structure the Church was building. If Mary Magdalene's version of Christianity had prevailed, there would have been no justification for clerical celibacy, no basis for excluding women from religious authority, no need for the elaborate hierarchy that came to define institutional Christianity. So they made sure it didn't prevail. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's gospel was part of a larger campaign to eliminate what scholars now call Gnostic Christianity. This was the mystical branch of early Christianity that emphasized direct spiritual experience over institutional authority. It was the tradition that produced texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and dozens of other alternative gospels that presented Jesus as a wisdom teacher rather than a sacrificial savior. The campaign against Gnostic Christianity was brutal and systematic. Church leaders declared these texts heretical. They excommunicated anyone who taught Gnostic ideas. They ordered the burning of Gnostic libraries and the persecution of Gnostic communities. By the 4th century, they had largely succeeded in driving this entire tradition underground. But the most insidious part of the suppression wasn't just destroying the texts, it was rewriting the story of who Mary Magdalene actually was. Because even after they eliminated her gospel, her name still appeared in the canonical scriptures. She was still identified as the first witness to the resurrection, still described as a devoted disciple. They couldn't erase her completely without raising uncomfortable questions. So instead, they transformed her. Pope Gregory's sermon in 591 was the culmination of centuries of gradual character assassination. By declaring Mary Magdalene a reformed prostitute, the Church accomplished something brilliant and sinister. They turned the woman who had once been Jesus' primary disciple into a symbol of female sinfulness, redeemed through submission to male religious authority. This transformation served multiple purposes. It explained away Mary Magdalene's prominent role in the Gospel stories by suggesting she was saved by Jesus rather than chosen by him. It created a powerful archetype of the fallen woman who finds redemption through the Church. And most importantly, it made the idea that Mary Magdalene had ever held spiritual authority over men seem absurd and offensive. The strategy worked so well that it persisted for over 1400 years. Even today, many Christians still think of Mary Magdalene primarily as a repentant prostitute rather than as the apostle to the apostles. The Church's rebranding campaign was so successful that it completely overwrote the historical record in popular consciousness. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Recent scholarship has revealed that the suppression of Mary Magdalene's gospel was just one battle in a much larger war. The institutional church didn't just want to eliminate alternative interpretations of Jesus' teachings. They wanted to control the entire narrative of Christian origins. This meant suppressing not just Mary Magdalene, but any early Christian figure who represented a different vision of what the movement should become. They eliminated texts that portrayed Jesus as primarily a wisdom teacher. They suppressed gospels that emphasized mystical experience over institutional salvation. They destroyed any evidence that early Christian communities had been more egalitarian, more diverse, more spiritually experimental than the Church wanted to admit. The result was a kind of historical amnesia. For over a millennium, Christians knew only the version of their faith's origins that the institutional church chose to preserve. They had no idea that there had ever been alternative gospels, competing traditions, or different interpretations of Jesus' message. This wasn't just about controlling the past. It was about controlling the future. By eliminating alternative voices from Christian history, the Church ensured that future believers would never imagine that Christianity could be anything other than what the institutional Church said it was. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts shattered this monopoly on Christian origins. Suddenly, scholars could see that early Christianity had been far more diverse and dynamic than anyone had imagined. They could read the actual words of Mary Magdalene and other suppressed voices. They could compare these alternative gospels with the canonical texts and see how different the original Christian movement really was. What they found was revolutionary. These suppressed texts revealed that the Christianity we know today isn't the inevitable result of Jesus' teachings. It's the product of specific historical choices made by specific people for specific reasons, and those choices weren't always made in service of truth or spiritual authenticity. Often, they were made in service of power and institutional control. This realization has profound implications for how we understand not just Christian history, but religious authority in general. If the Church could successfully suppress Mary Magdalene's gospel for over a millennium, if they could transform her from a spiritual teacher into a repentant sinner, if they could eliminate entire traditions from the historical record, then what else might they have hidden? What other voices have been silenced? What other truths have been buried? The story of Mary Magdalene's suppressed gospel isn't just ancient history. It's a case study in how religious institutions shape and control spiritual narratives. It's a reminder that the official version of events isn't always the true version. And it's a warning about the dangers of allowing any single authority to claim exclusive access to divine truth. But the suppression of Mary Magdalene goes deeper than just rewriting her story. What I discovered next will make your blood run cold, because this wasn't just about eliminating one woman's voice. This was about establishing a template for how religious institutions control truth itself. When you start mapping out the timeline of suppression, you see a pattern that's both systematic and chilling. The Church didn't just attack Mary Magdalene's gospel. They developed an entire methodology for eliminating inconvenient truths. First, they would declare certain texts unreliable. Then, they would question the credibility of anyone who taught from those texts. Finally, they would create alternative narratives that made the original version seem impossible or offensive. This three-step process became their standard operating procedure for dealing with any teaching that threatened their authority, and Mary Magdalene was their test case. They perfected their suppression techniques on her, then applied them to dozens of other early Christian figures and texts. Take the Gospel of Thomas, for instance. This text presents Jesus as a wisdom teacher who spoke in parables and riddles designed to provoke direct spiritual insight. There's no mention of crucifixion, no resurrection story, no emphasis on Jesus as a sacrificial savior. Instead, Thomas records Jesus saying things like, "The kingdom of heaven is within you and all around you, and split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there." These teachings suggest that the divine is accessible to everyone, everywhere, without need for institutional mediation. Just like Mary Magdalene's gospel, the Gospel of Thomas presented a version of Christianity that had no need for priests, bishops, or papal authority. So it had to go. The Church declared it heretical. They banned its use in Christian communities. They ordered copies burned wherever they were found. And they created stories about Thomas that transformed him from a recorder of Jesus' wisdom into doubting Thomas, the apostle whose faith was weak and unreliable. Sound familiar? It's the exact same playbook they used against Mary Magdalene. Transform the person's image, eliminate their texts, and make sure future generations never take their teaching seriously. But here's where it gets really sinister. The Church didn't just suppress these texts randomly. They had a clear criteria for what had to be eliminated. Any gospel or letter that suggested salvation could be achieved without church mediation was dangerous. Any text that portrayed women as spiritual equals was threatening. Any teaching that emphasized direct mystical experience over institutional authority was heretical. This wasn't about preserving authentic Christianity. This was about preserving a specific version of Christianity that justified the Church's power structure. And they were willing to destroy any evidence that contradicted their preferred narrative. The scope of this suppression is staggering when you really understand it. Scholars estimate that there were dozens, possibly hundreds of early Christian texts that were systematically eliminated. We know about some of them from references in other writings. Others have been partially recovered from archaeological discoveries, but many have been lost forever, victims of the Church's campaign to control Christian truth. What makes this even more disturbing is how successful they were. For over a millennium, most Christians had no idea that alternative Gospels had ever existed. They thought the 4 canonical Gospels were the only records of Jesus' teachings. They had no clue that Mary Magdalene had written her own Gospel, or that Thomas had recorded different sayings, or that dozens of other disciples had preserved alternative versions of the Christian message. The Church created what scholars now call manufactured orthodoxy. They took one particular strand of early Christianity and declared it the only legitimate tradition. Then they systematically eliminated all evidence that other traditions had ever existed. The result was a kind of spiritual totalitarianism that controlled not just what people could believe, but what they could even imagine believing. And Mary Magdalene became the perfect symbol of this manufactured orthodoxy. By transforming her from apostle to prostitute, the Church sent a clear message about what happened to women who claimed spiritual authority. They turned her into a cautionary tale that would keep other women from challenging male religious dominance for centuries. But let me tell you about something that will absolutely blow your mind. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that Mary Magdalene's influence in early Christianity was even greater than her own gospel suggests. Excavations in southern France have uncovered evidence of early Christian communities that were centered around her teachings. These weren't small, isolated groups. These were thriving spiritual centers that attracted followers from across the Mediterranean world. The most significant discovery came from a site near Marseille, where archaeologists found the remains of what appears to have been a major Christian learning center from the 2nd century. The architecture is unlike anything found in traditional early Christian sites. Instead of the simple meeting halls typical of early churches, this complex contained elaborate chambers that seemed designed for mystical practices and initiation ceremonies. But here's the kicker. Inscriptions found throughout the site repeatedly reference the beloved disciple and the one who knew the secret teachings. While these inscriptions don't mention Mary Magdalene by name, they use terminology that appears throughout her Gospel and other Gnostic texts associated with her tradition. Carbon dating of artifacts from the site confirms that this community was active for several centuries before mysteriously disappearing around the time that the institutional church began its major campaigns against heretical teachings. The timing isn't coincidental. This appears to be direct archaeological evidence of the systematic destruction of Mary Magdalene's spiritual legacy. What's even more remarkable is that similar sites have been discovered in Egypt, Syria, and even as far away as India. These archaeological findings suggest that Mary Magdalene's teachings had spread much further than anyone previously imagined. Her tradition wasn't just a small heretical sect. It was a major branch of early Christianity that extended across continents. This completely changes our understanding of early Christian history. It means that the suppression of Mary Magdalene's Gospel wasn't just about eliminating one inconvenient text. It was about destroying an entire international spiritual movement that threatened the institutional church's monopoly on Christian truth. The evidence keeps mounting. In 2012, scholars announced the discovery of a 4th century papyrus fragment that contained a phrase that sent shockwaves through biblical scholarship. Jesus said to them, "My wife." The fragment, known as the Gospel of Jesus' wife, was immediately controversial. Some scholars questioned its authenticity. Others argued that even if genuine, it didn't prove that Jesus was actually married. But here's what's really significant about this discovery. The fragment uses terminology and theological concepts that are consistent with Mary Magdalene's Gospel and other Gnostic texts. Whether or not it's authentic, it demonstrates that early Christian communities were discussing the possibility of Jesus having a wife or spiritual partner. And given Mary Magdalene's prominent role in these communities, it's not hard to guess who that partner might have been. The Church's response to this discovery was swift and predictable. They immediately questioned the fragment's authenticity. They argued that even if it was genuine, it represented heretical thinking rather than historical fact. They deployed the same three-step suppression strategy they had used for centuries: discredit the source, question the messenger, create alternative explanations. But the damage was already done. The mere possibility that Jesus might have had a wife, and that this wife might have been Mary Magdalene, challenged fundamental assumptions about Christian origins. If Jesus was married, if Mary Magdalene was his spiritual partner as well as his disciple, then her authority in early Christian communities makes perfect sense. She wouldn't have been just another follower. She would have been Jesus's closest companion and chosen successor. This is why the Church fought so hard to suppress any suggestion of a special relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. It wasn't about protecting Jesus's celibacy or purity. It was about protecting their own authority structure. If Mary Magdalene was Jesus's wife and chosen successor, then the entire apostolic succession claimed by the Church was illegitimate. The Gospel of Philip makes this threat explicit. When it describes Jesus kissing Mary Magdalene and loving her more than the other disciples, it's not just talking about romantic affection. It's describing the transmission of spiritual authority from Jesus to Mary. In the mystical traditions of the time, this kind of intimate relationship was understood as the highest form of spiritual partnership. But the institutional church couldn't allow this interpretation to survive. They needed Jesus to be celibate, to justify clerical celibacy. They needed the male disciples to be his primary successors to justify male religious authority. And they needed Mary Magdalene to be subordinate to maintain their entire power structure. So they rewrote her story completely. Instead of Jesus's spiritual partner, she became a reformed sinner. Instead of his chosen successor, she became a grateful follower. Instead of the repository of his deepest teachings, she became a symbol of redemption through submission to church authority. The transformation was so complete that it survived for over 1400 years. Even after the Catholic Church officially acknowledged in 1969 that there was no biblical basis for calling Mary Magdalene a prostitute, the image persisted in popular consciousness. The Church's rebranding campaign had been so successful that it overwrote historical truth with manufactured mythology. But here's something that will really disturb you. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's gospel wasn't just about the past. It was about controlling the future of Christianity. By eliminating her voice from the Christian narrative, the Church ensured that certain questions would never be asked, certain possibilities would never be considered, certain spiritual paths would never be explored. Think about how different Christianity might have been if Mary Magdalene's gospel had been preserved alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Instead of a religion focused on salvation through institutional authority, we might have had a tradition that emphasized direct spiritual experience. Instead of a faith that subordinated women, we might have had a tradition that recognized spiritual equality between genders. Instead of a church that claimed exclusive access to divine truth, we might have had a movement that encouraged individual mystical exploration. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's gospel didn't just change Christian history, it changed the entire trajectory of Western spirituality. For over a millennium, European civilization was shaped by a version of Christianity that had systematically eliminated its mystical, egalitarian, and experiential dimensions. The result was a spiritual culture that emphasized obedience over insight, authority over experience, and submission over empowerment. But the story doesn't end with suppression, because something remarkable has been happening over the past few decades. Mary Magdalene's voice is being heard again, not just in academic circles, but in popular culture, in spiritual communities, in the imaginations of people who are hungry for a different kind of religious truth. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945 was just the beginning. Since then, scholars have been working to piece together the fragments of Mary Magdalene's lost tradition. They've been translating her gospel, analyzing her teachings, and reconstructing the spiritual movement that was built around her authority. What they've found is a version of Christianity that speaks to contemporary spiritual seekers in ways that traditional church doctrine often doesn't. Mary Magdalene's emphasis on direct experience resonates with people who have grown tired of religious intermediaries. Her recognition of women's spiritual equality appeals to those who have been marginalized by patriarchal religious structures. Her mystical approach to salvation attracts seekers who want more than institutional salvation. This isn't just academic interest. Mary Magdalene's rediscovered voice is inspiring a new generation of spiritual explorers. Churches are being founded based on her teachings. Books are being written about her suppressed gospel. Meditation practices are being developed around her mystical insights. In a sense, Mary Magdalene is experiencing a resurrection of her own. After 16 centuries of silence, her voice is rising from the desert sands to challenge religious authority once again. The church may have succeeded in suppressing her gospel for over a millennium, but they couldn't destroy the truth it contained. And now that truth is spreading faster than they can contain it. This is what makes the story of Mary Magdalene's suppressed gospel so relevant to our time. It's not just about ancient history. It's about the ongoing struggle between institutional authority and individual spiritual truth. It's about the power of suppressed voices to eventually break through even the most determined censorship. And it's about the possibility that there are other truths, other voices, other gospels still waiting to be discovered. The question isn't whether Mary Magdalene's gospel is authentic according to traditional church standards. The question is whether her voice offers something valuable to contemporary spiritual seekers. And based on the growing interest in her teachings, the answer seems to be a resounding yes. Her message of direct spiritual experience, of inner transformation, of equality between all seekers regardless of gender or status, speaks to fundamental human needs that institutional religion often fails to address. Whether or not you accept her gospel as historically accurate, her teachings offer a different way of understanding spirituality, authority, and the relationship between the individual and the divine. This is why her suppressed gospel continues to threaten religious establishments today. It's not just about historical accuracy, it's about spiritual authority. Mary Magdalene's voice challenges the assumption that divine truth can only be accessed through approved channels, interpreted by authorized personnel, and distributed according to institutional priorities. Her gospel suggests that the sacred is immediately accessible to anyone willing to undertake the inner journey. It proposes that spiritual authority comes from direct experience rather than institutional appointment. It argues that the kingdom of heaven isn't a distant reward but a present reality available to all seekers. These ideas are just as dangerous to religious establishments today as they were 2,000 years ago, which is why Mary Magdalene's story isn't finished. The suppression of her gospel may be ancient history, but the struggle it represents is ongoing. Every time someone claims direct access to spiritual truth, every time a woman asserts religious authority, every time a seeker chooses experience over doctrine, Mary Magdalene's voice speaks again. And this brings us to perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire cover-up, because what I discovered next reveals that the suppression of Mary Magdalene wasn't just about controlling one woman's story. It was about establishing a blueprint for information control that would be used again and again throughout history. When you examine the methods used to erase Mary Magdalene's gospel, you're looking at one of the earliest examples of systematic historical revisionism. The church didn't just destroy her texts. They developed a sophisticated propaganda campaign that would make modern spin doctors jealous. They understood that simply burning books wasn't enough. They had to change how people thought about the person behind those books. This is where the genius of Pope Gregory's strategy becomes clear. By declaring Mary Magdalene a reformed prostitute, he wasn't just diminishing her spiritual authority. He was creating what psychologists now call a cognitive framework. Once people accepted this new identity for Mary Magdalene, it became almost impossible for them to imagine her as anything else. The prostitute narrative didn't just replace her apostolic story. It made her apostolic story literally unthinkable. Think about how brilliant this was from a propaganda perspective. Gregory didn't need to provide evidence for his claims about Mary Magdalene's past. He just needed to repeat them often enough, and with enough authority that they became accepted truth. He understood something that modern advertisers know well. People don't just believe what they're told. They believe what they hear most often from sources they consider authoritative. This technique was so effective that it survived for 14 centuries. Even today, when most biblical scholars acknowledge that there's no evidence Mary Magdalene was ever a prostitute, the image persists in popular culture. Movies, books, and even church sermons continue to perpetuate Gregory's manufactured mythology. The lie became so deeply embedded in Christian consciousness that it's proven almost impossible to eradicate. But here's where this story takes an even darker turn. Recent research into early church documents has revealed that the suppression of Mary Magdalene's gospel was part of a much larger campaign that targeted not just alternative Christian texts, but alternative ways of thinking about spirituality itself. The church wasn't just trying to control what people believed about Jesus. They were trying to control how people approached the divine. Consider what Mary Magdalene's gospel actually taught about the spiritual journey. According to her text, salvation wasn't something that happened to you through external intervention. It was something you achieved through inner work, through direct experience, through personal transformation. This wasn't just a different theology. It was a different epistemology, a different way of knowing truth. In Mary's tradition, spiritual authority came from within. You didn't need priests to interpret divine will for you, because you could access that will directly. You didn't need institutional sacraments to receive grace, because grace was your natural state once you recognized your divine nature. You didn't need to wait for salvation because enlightenment was available in every moment to anyone willing to look inward. This kind of thinking was absolutely incompatible with the institutional church that was emerging in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The church's entire business model depended on being the exclusive mediator between humanity and the divine. If people could access spiritual truth directly, what role was left for the church? So they didn't just suppress Mary Magdalene's specific teachings. They suppressed the entire approach to spirituality that her gospel represented. They declared that direct mystical experience was dangerous, unreliable, potentially demonic. They insisted that spiritual truth could only be accessed through approved channels, interpreted by authorized personnel, and distributed according to institutional protocols. The result was what scholars now call the domestication of Christian mysticism. The wild, experimental, deeply personal spirituality of the early Christian communities was gradually tamed, regulated, and brought under institutional control. Mystical experiences were still permitted, but only if they confirmed orthodox doctrine and submitted to clerical authority. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It took centuries to complete. But Mary Magdalene's suppression was a crucial early victory in this campaign. By eliminating the most prominent female voice advocating for direct spiritual experience, the Church sent a clear message about what kinds of spiritual authority would be tolerated going forward. The archaeological evidence for this systematic suppression is overwhelming once you know how to look for it. Excavations across the former Roman Empire have uncovered the remains of early Christian communities that were clearly practicing forms of spirituality very different from what later became Orthodox Christianity. These sites contain ritual chambers, meditation spaces, and symbolic artwork that suggest mystical practices far more elaborate than anything found in traditional early churches. But here's what's really telling. Most of these alternative Christian sites show clear signs of deliberate destruction that coincides with the Church's major anti-heretical campaigns. Buildings were torn down, artwork was defaced, libraries were burned. These weren't natural declines or gradual abandonment. These were systematic elimination campaigns designed to erase all physical evidence of alternative Christian traditions. The site near Marseille that I mentioned earlier is a perfect example. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed that the original complex was much larger than what's visible today. Entire sections of the site appear to have been deliberately buried or destroyed. Stone blocks that clearly belonged to ritual chambers have been found scattered across the area, as if someone had systematically dismantled the buildings and scattered the pieces to prevent reconstruction. Carbon dating of the destruction layers at these sites tells a consistent story. The demolition happened during the 4th and 5th centuries, exactly when the institutional church was consolidating power and launching major campaigns against heretical teachings. The timing is too consistent across too many sites to be coincidental. This was clearly a coordinated effort to eliminate physical traces of alternative Christian traditions. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from a site in Egypt, where archaeologists found what appears to be a deliberately buried library. Hundreds of manuscripts had been carefully sealed in pottery jars and hidden in underground chambers. Many of these texts were Gnostic Gospels and mystical treatises similar to those found at Nag Hammadi. But here's what makes this discovery so chilling. Some of the manuscripts show clear signs of having been damaged before they were buried. Pages had been torn out. Key passages had been scraped away. Names had been systematically deleted. Someone had deliberately mutilated these texts before hiding them, as if they wanted to preserve some record of their existence while making sure the most dangerous ideas couldn't survive intact. This suggests that even within the communities that treasured these alternative gospels, there were people who understood how dangerous they had become. They couldn't bear to destroy the texts completely, but they also couldn't risk preserving them in their original form. So they created a compromise. They saved fragments, partial records, damaged copies that would preserve some memory of the suppressed traditions without providing enough information to fully reconstruct them. This kind of selective preservation explains why so many early Christian texts have survived only in fragmentary form. It's not just that they're old and paper deteriorates. It's that they were deliberately damaged by people who were caught between the desire to preserve important spiritual teachings and the need to protect themselves from persecution. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene itself shows evidence of this kind of deliberate mutilation. The version found at Nag Hammadi is missing crucial pages, including what scholars believe would have been the most explicit descriptions of her special relationship with Jesus and her most detailed teachings about mystical practice. These weren't random losses due to age. The missing sections correspond exactly to the kinds of content that church authorities found most threatening. This pattern of selective destruction reveals something important about how the suppression campaign actually worked. The church didn't just ban heretical texts and hope for the best. They had detailed knowledge of what these texts contained, and they specifically targeted the most dangerous passages for elimination. This suggests a level of coordination and planning that goes far beyond spontaneous religious persecution. Someone was systematically cataloging the content of alternative Christian texts, identifying the most threatening ideas, and directing destruction efforts to eliminate those specific concepts while allowing less dangerous material to survive. This wasn't random book burning. This was surgical information warfare designed to eliminate specific ideas while creating plausible deniability about the scope of the suppression. The sophistication of this campaign becomes even clearer when you examine the alternative narratives that were created to replace the suppressed stories. Take the legend of Mary Magdalene in France, for instance. According to medieval tradition, Mary Magdalene fled Palestine after Jesus' crucifixion and lived out her days as a hermit in southern France. This story became incredibly popular during the Middle Ages and helped establish several major pilgrimage sites. But here's what's interesting about this legend. It acknowledges Mary Magdalene's importance while completely eliminating her role as a spiritual teacher. In the French tradition, she's portrayed as a penitent who spent her final years in solitary prayer and meditation. She's holy, but she's silent. She's revered, but she has no voice. She's important to the faith, but she poses no threat to male religious authority. This is exactly the kind of narrative replacement that characterizes sophisticated propaganda campaigns. The Church didn't try to make people forget Mary Magdalene completely. They understood that her name appeared too prominently in the canonical Gospels for total erasure to be credible. Instead, they created alternative stories that satisfied people's desire to honor her, while eliminating anything that might challenge institutional authority. The French legend of Mary Magdalene is brilliant propaganda because it gives people what they want while denying them what they need. People want to feel that Mary Magdalene was important, special, worthy of devotion. The hermit legend provides all of that. But people also need to understand what made her important, what wisdom she possessed, what teachings she offered. The hermit legend provides none of that. It's spiritual junk food, satisfying but not nourishing. This technique of narrative replacement was used throughout the suppression campaign. Alternative Christian figures weren't just erased. They were replaced with sanitized versions that maintained their emotional appeal while eliminating their intellectual content. Thomas became Doubting Thomas, the apostle whose faith was weak rather than the recorder of Jesus' wisdom sayings. Philip became just another disciple rather than the chronicler of Jesus' mystical teachings. Mary of Bethany was separated from Mary Magdalene to eliminate any suggestion that Jesus' closest female disciple might have been someone with whom he had an intimate relationship. Each of these narrative replacements served the same purpose. They preserved enough of the original story to maintain credibility while eliminating the elements that threatened institutional control. People could continue to feel connected to these figures without accessing the ideas that had made them dangerous to church authority. The success of this campaign is evident in how completely it shaped Christian consciousness for over a millennium. From the 6th century to the 20th century, most Christians knew only the sanitized versions of these early Christian figures. They had no idea that alternative gospels had ever existed, that different teachings had once been prominent, that the Christianity they knew was just one option among many that had once competed for adherence. This manufactured ignorance wasn't just about controlling the past, it was about limiting the future. By ensuring that Christians knew only one version of their faith's origins, the Church made it almost impossible for alternative versions to emerge. How could someone imagine a different kind of Christianity when they had no knowledge that different kinds had ever existed? But here's something that should make every person who values truth absolutely furious. The suppression campaign didn't end with the ancient world. It continued well into the modern era, adapting new techniques and technologies, but maintaining the same basic goal of controlling access to information about early Christian diversity. When the first Gnostic texts began to be discovered in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Church's response was swift and familiar. They questioned the authenticity of the manuscripts. They argued that even if genuine, these texts represented later corruptions of original Christian teaching rather than authentic early traditions. They suggested that studying such materials was spiritually dangerous and academically irresponsible. This response was remarkably similar to Pope Gregory's approach to Mary Magdalene. Instead of engaging with the content of the discovered texts, Church authorities focused on discrediting their legitimacy. They understood that the ideas contained in these manuscripts were still dangerous, even after centuries of suppression. So they deployed the same three-step strategy that had worked so well in the ancient world: question the source, discredit the messenger, create alternative explanations. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945 represented a quantum leap in available evidence about early Christian diversity. Here was an entire collection of alternative gospels, mystical treatises, and Gnostic writings that had been preserved intact for over 16 centuries. The scope and quality of these manuscripts made it impossible to dismiss them as later corruptions or forgeries. But the Church's response revealed how deeply committed they remained to controlling the narrative about Christian origins. Instead of celebrating the discovery of previously lost Christian texts, many Church authorities expressed concern about how these materials might confuse the faithful. Instead of supporting scholarly efforts to translate and study the manuscripts, some religious leaders argued that such research was unnecessary and potentially harmful. This resistance to new information about early Christianity reveals something crucial about institutional religious authority. It's not actually based on preserving authentic Christian teaching. It's based on preserving a specific narrative about Christian origins that supports current power structures. Any evidence that challenges this narrative, regardless of its historical value, is treated as a threat to be contained rather than a gift to be celebrated. The story of how Mary Magdalene's Gospel was finally translated and published illustrates this dynamic perfectly. When scholars first announced that one of the Nag Hammadi texts was a Gospel attributed to Mary Magdalene, the response from religious authorities was immediate skepticism. They questioned whether the text was really ancient. They argued that even if it was old, it didn't represent authentic Christian teaching. They suggested that publishing it would mislead people about the true nature of Christianity. But here's what's really telling about this response. None of these authorities had actually read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene when they began criticizing it. Their opposition wasn't based on careful examination of its contents. It was based on the simple fact that it existed and that it bore Mary Magdalene's name. They understood intuitively that any text presenting Mary Magdalene as a spiritual authority would challenge their preferred narrative about Christian origins. This kind of preemptive resistance to new information reveals the deep insecurity that underlies institutional religious authority. If church leaders were confident that their version of Christian history was accurate and complete, they would welcome new evidence that might confirm or refine their understanding. But when they resist new information before even examining it, they reveal that their authority depends on maintaining ignorance rather than promoting knowledge. The gradual translation and publication of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene over the past several decades has validated these institutional fears. As more people have gained access to Mary Magdalene's actual words, traditional narratives about early Christianity have become increasingly difficult to maintain. Her Gospel doesn't just present an alternative version of Christian teaching. It reveals that alternative versions once existed and were actively suppressed. This is why Mary Magdalene's rediscovered voice continues to be so threatening to religious establishments today. It's not just that her teachings differ from orthodox doctrine. It's that her very existence proves that orthodox doctrine was constructed through exclusion and suppression rather than natural development. Her gospel is living evidence that Christianity could have been something very different if different choices had been made by the people who controlled its early development. The implications extend far beyond Christianity itself. Mary Magdalene's story reveals how any dominant narrative about the past is constructed and maintained. It shows how institutional authorities use their control over information to shape not just what people know, but what they can imagine knowing. It demonstrates how effectively alternative voices can be eliminated from collective memory through systematic suppression campaigns. But perhaps most importantly, Mary Magdalene's eventual resurrection from historical obscurity proves that suppressed truths have a way of eventually surfacing. No matter how thorough the suppression campaign, no matter how complete the narrative control, authentic voices find ways to break through. The sand of the Egyptian desert preserved Mary Magdalene's words for 16 centuries until the world was ready to hear them again. This gives us hope for other suppressed voices, other buried truths, other alternative perspectives that may still be waiting to be discovered. Mary Magdalene's story suggests that information wants to be free, that authentic spiritual insights have a kind of persistence that outlasts even the most determined efforts to eliminate them. Her gospel reminds us that the official version of any story is just one version among many possible versions. It encourages us to ask what voices might be missing from the narratives we've been taught to accept as complete and accurate. It challenges us to remain open to new information that might complicate or contradict our existing beliefs. Most importantly, Mary Magdalene's rediscovered voice empowers us to trust our own spiritual experience rather than depending entirely on institutional interpretation. Her gospel suggests that divine truth is accessible to anyone willing to look within, that spiritual authority comes from authentic experience rather than official appointment, that the sacred can be encountered directly by any sincere seeker. This message is just as revolutionary today as it was 2,000 years ago. In an age when religious institutions continue to claim exclusive access to divine truth, Mary Magdalene's voice reminds us that such claims have always been false. The suppression of her gospel wasn't about protecting authentic Christianity, it was about protecting institutional power. And recognizing this distinction is the first step towards spiritual freedom. The story of Mary Magdalene's suppressed gospel isn't finished because the struggle it represents is ongoing. Every time someone questions religious authority, every time a seeker chooses direct experience over institutional doctrine, every time a suppressed voice finds a way to speak again, Mary Magdalene's gospel lives on. Her words may have been buried for 16 centuries, but the spirit they embody is eternal and unstoppable. And here's what should terrify every person who values spiritual freedom. The techniques used to suppress Mary Magdalene's gospel didn't disappear with the ancient world. They evolved, adapted, and became the foundation for every modern information control system we see today. The same three-step process that erased her voice for 16 centuries is being used right now to shape what you think, what you believe, and what you can even imagine as possible. Think about it. Step 1. Declare the source unreliable. How many times have you seen inconvenient information dismissed not because it's been proven false, but because it comes from the wrong messenger? Step 2. Question the credibility of anyone who promotes that information. How often do you see people attacked personally rather than having their ideas addressed directly? Step 3. Create alternative narratives that make the original seem impossible or offensive. How frequently do you encounter stories that feel designed to make you stop asking uncomfortable questions? This isn't coincidence. This is the Mary Magdalene playbook, refined and perfected over 2 millennia. The Church may have lost its monopoly on information control, but the methods they pioneered are alive and thriving in every institution that depends on managing public perception. But here's where Mary Magdalene's story becomes prophetic, because just as her voice eventually broke through 16 centuries of suppression, authentic truth has a way of surfacing no matter how sophisticated the control systems become. The same forces that preserved her gospel in the Egyptian desert are still operating today, protecting information that powerful interests want to keep buried. Recent discoveries have revealed that Mary Magdalene's influence extended even further than we imagined. Archaeological excavations in Turkey have uncovered what appears to be a major early Christian center that was completely dedicated to her teachings. The site contains elaborate underground chambers with frescoes depicting a female figure instructing groups of both men and women. The artistic style and symbolic content match perfectly with themes from her gospel. But here's what makes this discovery absolutely explosive. Carbon dating places this site's active period in the 1st and 2nd centuries, making it contemporary with the earliest Christian communities we know about. This isn't some later development or fringe movement. This is evidence that Mary Magdalene's tradition was a major force in Christianity from the very beginning. The implications are staggering. If Mary Magdalene had established teaching centers across the Mediterranean world, if her tradition was training spiritual leaders of both genders, if her influence was widespread enough to support major architectural projects, then the suppression campaign against her wasn't just about eliminating one inconvenient woman. It was about destroying an entire parallel Christian civilization. Think about what this means. For nearly 2,000 years, we've been told that early Christianity was a unified movement that gradually developed into the institutional church we know today. But the archaeological evidence suggests something completely different. Early Christianity appears to have been a collection of competing traditions, with Mary Magdalene's mystical, egalitarian approach being one of the largest and most influential. The Church didn't just suppress her gospel. They destroyed an entire Christian culture that had been built around her teachings. They eliminated not just her words, but the communities that had formed around those words, the practices that had emerged from those communities, the spiritual lineages that had been passed down through her disciples. This is genocide on a spiritual level, the systematic elimination of an entire way of understanding and practicing Christianity. And it was so successful that for over a millennium, most Christians had no idea that this alternative tradition had ever existed. But here's something that will make your skin crawl. Recent analysis of medieval church documents has revealed that the suppression didn't end with the ancient world. Church authorities continued to hunt down and destroy any traces of Mary Magdalene's tradition well into the Middle Ages. They had lists of books to be burned, names of people to be watched, locations where alternative Christian practices might be taking place. One particularly chilling document from the 13th century contains what appears to be an instruction manual for identifying and eliminating Magdalene heretics. It describes specific practices associated with her tradition, warns about the dangers of women claiming spiritual authority, and provides detailed procedures for interrogating suspected followers of her teachings. This document reveals that Mary Magdalene's tradition had survived underground for over 1,000 years after the official suppression began. Communities were still secretly practicing her teachings, still passing down her gospel, still maintaining the mystical Christianity that the institutional church thought it had destroyed. The fact that church authorities were still actively hunting these communities in the 13th century proves that the suppression was never as complete as they claimed. Mary Magdalene's voice kept speaking through hidden channels, preserved by people who understood that her teachings contained something too valuable to lose. But it also reveals the paranoid vigilance required to maintain the Church's manufactured orthodoxy. They couldn't just suppress her gospel once and move on. They had to constantly monitor for any signs that her tradition was resurging. They had to maintain active surveillance and elimination programs for centuries, because they knew that authentic spiritual truth has a way of breaking through even the most determined censorship. This ongoing campaign of suppression extended to art, literature, and popular culture. Church authorities didn't just burn Mary Magdalene's theological writings. They systematically eliminated any artistic or literary works that portrayed her as anything other than a repentant sinner. Paintings that showed her as a teacher were destroyed. Poems that celebrated her wisdom were banned. Stories that suggested she had special knowledge were declared heretical. The result was a complete cultural cleansing. By the late Middle Ages, it had become literally impossible to find any mainstream artistic representation of Mary Magdalene that didn't conform to Pope Gregory's prostitute narrative. The Church had succeeded in rewriting not just theological history, but the entire cultural memory of one of Christianity's most important figures. Yet, even this wasn't enough. Church documents from the Renaissance period show continued anxiety about Mary Magdalene's potential influence. As literacy rates increased and printing technology made books more widely available, church authorities worried that suppressed texts might resurface and spread beyond their control. They were right to worry. The Protestant Reformation, which began in the 16th century, was partly fueled by questions about church authority and historical accuracy. As reformers like Martin Luther challenged papal power, they inevitably began asking what other aspects of church teaching might be based on institutional convenience rather than authentic Christian tradition. So here we are, at the end of a journey that reveals one of history's most calculated cover-ups. Mary Magdalene's story isn't just about ancient texts or forgotten gospels. It's about the power to control truth itself, to decide what voices get heard and which ones disappear into the sand. For 16 centuries, her words lay buried, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Today, her voice rises again, challenging every assumption we've been taught about faith, authority, and the right to seek truth directly. The question isn't whether you believe her gospel. The question is whether you're ready to imagine that everything you've been told about spiritual authority might be incomplete. Because if they could silence Mary Magdalene for 2 millennia, what other truths are still waiting to be unearthed?